I'm excited to share with you a surprising attacking plan in the Italian game, which was played recently in the 2025 US Championship between Hans Niemann as white against Fabiano Caruana. And before I share with you this surprising attacking system, you might find the Italian a rather frustrating opening to play against, as for example, if you play bishop c5 and try to match their development. White gets to choose the nature of the position. They can play very actively with d4 and set some problems for you with the move pawn e5 after takes. But they can also play a move like d3 and just play very solidly, more long-term kind of play with some quite natural moves for white, as it were. But on the other hand, let's say if you start with a move like knight f6, again, white can play d3 and just play super solid, super safe. But they can also play the move knight g5, heading into some sharp complications, where if you don't remember the theory well, you could end up in some hot water as black. And so in this video, I'm going to show you a different way of playing it, a little bit more creative, where it's true we take a little bit more risk, but we also throw the opponent onto our home turf and put them under a lot of pressure with this move of d6. And the fact is that Hans Niemann lost in just 28 moves with the white pieces to Caruana. Of course, Hanjo's FIDE rating of 2738, quite close to being in the world top 10 on the FIDE ratings. So if it's going to be hard for him to deal with, then imagine how hard it's going to be for your opponents. Also, by the way, if you do enjoy this video, do make sure to hit the like button and also to consider subscribing as well. That just tells me to make more videos like this one. And also it will allow me to hopefully try to keep the legacy of the late Daniel Naroditsky going, because the way in which Caruana played this game, I know that Naroditsky would absolutely love the King's Indian style, very attacking style of play that Caruana did in this game. So before I get into the move in the game, which was the move c3, c3, it's the second most common move in the position. It's one that you can sort of expect to face quite a bit if you're rated, let's say, 2000 or 2200 plus. But if you're rated below that, you're probably going to face some other moves a fair bit more often. So let's break them down one by one. And just to let you know, there will be quite a lot of theory that we'll be talking about. So if you do want to just skip ahead and see the game and not go into the theory, you can click on the timestamp to do that in the description. But let's see how the position can play out. So if you want a kind of lazy way to play, you can just play bishop e7, knight f6, and castles against virtually everything. That will often transpose into other variations that we'll see later on. But the price you pay for this ease is that you do miss some opportunities to put more pressure on the opponent's position. For example, the move knight a5 is a nice little idea that becomes possible because our move d6 did defend the pawn on e5. And then after bishop e2, you can transition to a Sicilian type of position where white is not able to really get in the move of d4. Our next moves are going to be pretty obvious, like just fighting for the control of the d5 square. And it's not so easy for white to really use that d5 outpost, because if they move, then we can take, and then they're stuck with a pawn on d5 rather than having the knight on the outpost. And that's the reason why black is quite happy in a position like this one. The move of castles doesn't have a whole lot of independent value for us, in that we can just play the move bishop e7, and then after, let's say, d4, we can play knight f6 and just head back to familiar territory anyway, with this a little bit annoying attack on the e4 pawn, as it were. If you want to play it more creatively, you can play bishop g4 and go for this bit annoying pin on the knight. But I will say, if white knows bishop b5, that this pin does give white a little bit of an advantage. So that's why I thought just bishop e7 is a bit more practical. If they play d3, this is a good moment for you to see if you remember one of the ideas I mentioned for a little bit earlier, because it actually works even better here. Remember that when the e5 pawn is defended, it frees up our c6 knight, and the move of knight to a5 does allow us to grab that bishop pair. And you can choose which way you want to play it. After takes, you could just continue with the usual solid development and be totally okay. But an idea we'll see Caruana play a bit later is this idea of playing d5, playing f5, I should say, and just putting the pressure against the pawn and having the two pawns side by side in the center. Kind of plays like a turbocharged King's Gambit where we didn't have to sacrifice a pawn and we even got the bishop pair as an added bonus as such. So it kind of shows it's not so easy for white just to play safely and just avoid all the complications. We're kind of forcing a little bit in our type of position here. Now, a move like h3 is a move that is somewhat common, and if you want a lazy solution, you can just play something like bishop e7 and just play knight f6, or even play a move like e d4 and kind of argue that the move h3 might not be the most useful. And there are even some fun ideas. We can play knight e5 and c5 and try to go after their bishop, where the engine has a little bit of a soft spot for some of these more direct ideas, where you sort of use the bad place of bishop to kind of make up for weakening the d5 square. If it wasn't for this c4, like this would be a pretty big positional mistake to give this square a silver platter. But the fact we can kind of go after their bishop is sort of what allows us to make it work. That being said, I also think that you could just play a move like bishop e6. I think that one is the more fun way of playing it, where, whether they take or whether they move the bishop, it will change the nature of the position a little bit. But if they move the bishop away, they are kind of losing a tempo, so that's already a good sign for us. And if they do take, it's just a very healthy position where we kind of know how we're going to develop our pieces. And then after takes, I can offer a little bit of an improvement over, or at least an alternative to the great trainer Kuzman's analysis, where instead of playing knight d4 in this sort of plan like he advocates, you can play queen d7 and put the knight a bit more actively, and that's also another way to play it. So that basically overviews the move h3, and now we get to the moves that are a little bit more critical. Namely, the move of d4 is the one that you can really expect to see the most often at a high level of play. And I used to think that this was just very good for white, because if black were to take on c4, you kind of have an improved Scotch game where you're not able to put that pressure on the center because we blocked in the bishop with the pawn. To be fair, even if you do end up playing this by accident, it's not like the worst position in the world. I can still develop quietly and have a playable game, but definitely it's a lot more in the spirit of the position to play knight f6 and kind of ask white how they're going to defend that pawn on e4 in this position. There are a lot of choices that white can play, and I will admit that this theoretical section, like if you're somewhat new to chess, some of the variations might be a little bit overwhelming if you were to try to remember it, so it would be more useful for you to just try to pick up the general ideas, just make a note of what patterns are coming up continually in the variations, and that will serve you better than trying to memorize everything by heart. There are a lot of different branches. I'll just arrow some of the moves. There's basically, you could say, 5 serious tries for white. I know I wouldn't be doing my job here if I didn't at least touch on all of them. But some of them are definitely easier to kind of understand than others. Like one of the ideas of this setup, and one of the reasons why it definitely has that Naroditsky kind of feel to it, is that, well, after d5 and knight b8, what does this kind of structure remind you of? Well, if you've played chess for a while, you'll probably notice that it's kind of like a King's Indian structure, but where instead of the pawn being on c4 and having a very flexible pawn chain, the bishop is stuck on c4 instead. Now, that's not to say, that the black is just doing, incredibly, because, it is true he also lost a bit of time moving the knight back and forth. So, in a way, both sides kind of gave up something. It was like a little bit of a bartering back and forth. And here, if you're a more advanced player, you're going to want to know this move of knight d7. The reason it's kind of important to get in the move knight c5 as quickly as possible here is that if white plays a move like c4, let's say, and tries to defend the pawn as you might expect, well, if you give white time to play bishop c2, then your knight is in danger of getting kicked away. And even if you play a move like a5, it's still a little bit of a passive sub, where eventually white is going to be able to kick away that knight with b4 and just get a very fast attack on the queen side. That's basically the plan that white's going for in these King's Indian type of structures. The way we can deal with that, though, is just by taking the bishop before it has a chance to move. It does give us the bishop pair advantage to kind of offset white's extra space. And as well, the exchange of the minor pieces definitely relieves our cramp a little bit when we have a space disadvantage. But the position's definitely quite healthy. You can move your knight away and go f5 as in the King's Indian to put some pressure against the white king. and against the white center. And if white goes c5, you can still play this anyway. Like, you don't have to trade and let your pawns get doubled. You can just keep the position as is, just ignore it as if nothing happened. And we kind of see the difference here compared to a normal King's Indian, because in a normal King's Indian have the time to, put a lot of pressure on d6, c7, and make our life a little bit difficult. But the pressure on the center and the fact we can also just go for the pawn storm with f4, g5, g4, much like we'll see in the main game, is just not going to let white get this in. And if it takes, we also develop the bishop with a tempo. And white is not really able to use the e4 outpost because we're in time to challenge that knight, as it were. So it's a bit of a deep explanation, but I do understand that not everyone's going to have a lot of experience with the King's Indian structures. Just wanted to share it just so that it makes sense to everyone here. As for the move of castles, there's a few different ways that you can play it as black. Some are like a bit more human than others, you could say. Probably the most fun lines are the ones that start with bishop g4, where you kind of pin the knight and make it a little bit difficult for white to defend the pawn on d4. But there are some alternatives that can be played as well here. For example, if we were to ask the computer what is the best continuation, at a high depth, the engine will tell you that you can take on d4, trade off a lot of minor pieces, and basically play the position in a way that William Steinitz and Emmanuel Lasker, who often played this Steinitz system against Aurore Lopez with d6, basically just playing this very solid, you can go through ideas like knight d7, rook e8, bishop f6 to try to organize the pieces. Or if you're a computer, you can, play it this way, where you can either get some counterplay with b5, bishop b7, and attack the pawn. Or if they do decide to stop that with a4, you can then play the move of bishop e6 and, again, try to trade off some of those minor pieces to relieve the cramp. Or if they keep the tension, just go bishop f6, rook e8, kind of bring the knight around to pressure them. And that is going to be a reasonably healthy position for black, objectively speaking. But I do think that from the human point of view, it's a lot easier to play white. White has different ways to try to use the extra space to build up some pressure. Whereas I consider some of the other options to be potentially a little bit more enterprising. And it goes to show that you don't have to necessarily just play the engine's top line every time. But also that when you have more than one different way to play a shortcut like this one, it makes it, in a case if you're a more advanced player, it makes it harder for your opponents to prepare for you properly and thoroughly. But it also keeps the positions interesting and fresh for you in case you play this system for a long time. Now, bishop e7 is still possible here. The computer really is not the biggest fan of it, where it thinks the position with knight c3 is still good for white, which might seem like a very strange assessment when we consider that white doesn't really have a great pawn break with c4, c5, which is kind of the main plan to try to open up lines and use white's space advantage on the queen side. At the same time, because the black bishop is on e7 instead of g7, it's also not so easy for black to get in the pawn break. Like if you play f5 and white takes, white may be able to then use that e4 outpost to keep a good control over the position. Now white can play different moves here. Like for example, you go a4, you do have some ideas where you can potentially try to play on the dark squares. The engine maybe doesn't consider this totally equal, but it's certainly a legitimate enough approach to go for something like this. White could also play a move like bishop e3 and kind of wait for you to go c6 before a4, kind of making the point that if you were to take, which is kind of the whole point of hitting in the center, white can play this bishop d5 move, saying that if you take, you're just going to have a very nice outpost for the knight on d5. And it is probably fair to say that in a position like this, white does have an improved version of the knight off lines with a6, because black kind of lost a couple of tempi moving the knight back and forth, whereas white only really lost one tempo getting his bishop to a good square here. And also white can even play h3, like even a structure like this one is also going to be somewhat better for white, where it might look like you're able to get a lot of counterplay on the king side, but it does turn out that in a position like this, they can kind of meet f5 with f4 and sort of keep your king side attacking ideas a little bit at bay. So that's just to give a little bit of a warning as to why, if you're, let's say, a professional player, I probably would, maybe not necessarily enter these sort of structures. But at the same time, if your opponent hasn't stayed these positions before, there might be a little bit of a loss of what to do, whereas Black's plans tend to be a little bit more straightforward. So probably up to, say, a 2-200, 2-300 level, you can probably get away with this as Black. But that being said, I think the most fun line is definitely the Bishop G4 line. It does take the sting out of D5, as now Knight D4 does leverage the pin against the knight, as it were. If White plays a move D takes E5, we can then play Knight takes E5, and it sort of shows another advantage of having the pin against the knight that was prepared with the move of D6. And if White defends one piece or by moving the second piece to safety, well, then we can just simplify bishop takes, bishop E7. Eventually, we'll trade off that bishop pair advantage that White has. And even though White has more space and arguably a marginally more pleasant position because of that, we see that the exchange of two minor pieces does mean that if we just again go for the standard Steinitz-Lasker plan of, knight d7, bishop f6, rook e8, and just trading off more pieces from there, it's quite hard for White to really make use of their tiny advantage. And Black is very much playable in this, very much has a playable position here. So that kind of leaves the question, well, what if White keeps attention with c3 instead? Sort of not really caring about the bishop takes f3 and the doubling of the pawns. Well, we can play to move bishop e7 and, if rook e1, we kind of see the problem for White if they do try to play in a normal Royal Lepage style, that if they take with a queen, they will lose a pawn. Now the queen is no longer protecting the center as such. So the more critical question is the move of d5, and it might look like a bit of a weird position from a human point of view, because you might be thinking, well, the pawn belongs on c4, not on c3. But a more subtle point is that the bishop can be a little bit misplaced on g4, as you do often need that bishop to eventually, like say if you have pawns on f4 and g3, and you visualize them having pawns on f3 and h3, you do often need that bishop takes h3 as a sacrifice to break through and checkmate their king in these kind of King's Indian structures. So strategically, you have to be a little bit careful, but one idea that is a little bit creative, and I think you'll like it quite a lot, is this move of knight h7, which kind of shows the advantage of the bishop being on e7, that you can kind of trade off the minor pieces, you can trade off your knights, you can trade off your bad bishop with bishop g5, which is an idea that you see a few times in these kind of structures. It's a little bit of a difference compared to when the bishop is being carried on g7 Naroditsky style. But yeah, that's basically just showing some of the ideas, and castles is a move you will face a fair bit, so it's good to, of course, be ready for it. Now, the lines with knight g5 get a little bit spicy, and there's a really cool trap that I want to show you here, because after d5, e takes d5, we now have the move of knight takes d4. So we basically have a line known as the Ulvestad variation of the two knights with knight d4, but with the difference that White doesn't have a pawn on d2. So just to make that comparison really clear, it's say we had moved d5 and Black played knight d4. Well, yeah, it kind of makes sense that this is a better version for White when they still have technically an extra pawn at this moment. Whereas this version of material is equal, and that does leave Black in very good stead. The trap I really want to share happens if White plays d6, which I could definitely see as a sort of move that your opponents might just think they're doing very well with the attack on f7. But the point is that we can actually ignore it and play the move of queen takes d6. And just to make sure that you're paying attention here, what would be the follow-up if White plays knight takes f7? What's Black's idea to deal with this fork on the queen and the rook? You might want to put it in the comments below. Let's have some interactivity here. It's move 8 for Black, and what would be the move for Black in this position? If you need more time, you can also pause the video to either think about the position yourself or to get that time to write it down. But the answer is that we have the move queen c6, where we aren't just hitting the bishop, but we're also hitting g2. And if White were to execute the idea of taking the rook in the corner, even though we're down the rook in this position, it turns out we have a very, very strong initiative with bishop to g4, which very much limits White's options. It's very hard to get out of knight f3 at some point, and one very cool way the game could play out is after castles, again, threatening knight f3, and then if knight d2, we can even play a move like e4, just a very Morphy style, just bring all the pieces in the attack. The only thing stopping knight c2 being a checkmate here is that the queen is defending it. So if you're using your imagination a little bit, you'll be thinking, well, what's a way to get rid of the queen? And bishop b4 might come to mind. And white basically is busted, because if they take, knight c2 is a little crisscross checkmate, as it were. So that would be a very nice trap, of course, to get in one of your games. But the more important point is that even if they don't fall for this trap, you're still doing fine. Like if bishop f7, you are threatening h6 to win the knight or the bishop, and if they move back, we have a very suave queen a6 just to keep their king in the center. It's not so clear that our king is actually less safe than white's at this point, and we do have a bit of a lead in development to work with. There are some other moves they can play, but in general, yeah, black is just very, very happy in this sort of position. Probably the one move that's maybe a little bit difficult, and this is a bit more of an advanced move, but if they do try this d6, you do have knight f6 to cover this pawn. Just be a bit careful here. Don't just take the knight without thinking, because they do have bishop f7, and you can't take the bishop without losing the queen. But in this position, your king being in the center is obviously a much bigger problem than in the other line, when white can just castle very readily as such. So the way to avoid that is just to play queen d7, so that we can take their bishop. If they take our rook, and then their knight would be stuck in the corner, and we'd be able to win it over the next few moves. So instead, white should just take the knight, but then we just have very healthy development. We can castle long, and that's just going to give us a very happy game with active piece play and some decent chances to attack the king from there. Now, going back to some other options, we're starting to get a bit closer to the end of the coverage of d4, but the move knight c3 is quite an important move, and one where you've got a little bit of a choice. I will say that if you just want a lazy option where you don't have to remember many ideas, you can just play bishop e7 and just go for like castles, bishop g4, just very happy moves to gradually put the pressure on d4. But then you do have to be ready to play this position, which, like I said before from transposition, does give white a little bit of an advantage if they know what they're doing. To be fair, d6 is a bit of a shortcut, so even a lot of master level opponents may not be familiar with the positions as white. But of course, we should be intellectually honest about the risks. Now, knight c3, I like the move bishop g4 in response, and there's kind of a few ways in which the position can play out from here. I think the move bishop b5 is probably the best move for white, but it's also one of these moves you're probably not going to see all that often, because it's a little bit counterintuitive to move the bishop 2 times in a row. A move like d5, we can just meet with knight d4. That's really the big idea of bishop g4. Like we saw before, is it takes that sting out of d5 and it gives us that square for the knight. And in a position like this one with the doubled pawns, your plan's just going to be to go knight h5 and just kind of castle. And because it's a little bit of an unusual position, I will kind of show a few ideas. Note, by the way, f4 is not such a problem when we do have the move of knight g4, and we can just take their bishop as such, which is actually quite a big deal in the fianchetto positions when they don't have their dark squared bishop to counter our bishop. But let's say if it plays a little bit differently and we get a position like this. This one's a little bit more of a more advanced puzzle, but I want to show this idea to you anyway, because it's really going to help you kind of understand like the King's Indian types of positions that can sometimes arise in this line. And here a great question to ask, and to be fair, I'm probably going to be asking this question for quite a while to sort of remember his legacy and to, I guess, be a better person as well. But what would Naroditsky do in this position? And the answer is that Naroditsky would not play knight g3 and fix the pawn structure and let white get an easy attack. He would very much fight for the initiative and try to put pressure on the opponent. And that's what the move of knight to f4 does. Yeah, it's true that we're sacrificing a pawn, but first of all, we have the bishop pair advantage here. We've got this unopposed bishop pointing very close to their king. And we can also play a little prophylactic move h5 to stop their attack coming through. We can always play king h7 if needed to make sure our king is safe. And then we just have open slaver to throw the pawns at their king, and it's just a much easier position to play for black here. So a bit of a long explanation, but I think that when it comes to learning openings, really what you're learning is not so much the specific moves, but it's really about understanding the key ideas. Because the thing is, d6 is still a very fresh system. There aren't that many Grandmaster games in the variations. So, in the simple chess improvement system I have, I do recommend, playing model games and going through them to master an opening. But since there aren't so many here, that's why I want to share with you the ideas from that human perspective and give you that understanding that, your opponents won't be able to access so easily without, putting in a lot of hard work. And, well, the even chess brains do like to, take a break and sometimes be a little bit lazy. So, yeah, it's nice, of course, when someone does the work for you. If white does play d5, this was a move that Aronian played in a game. One difference you'll notice with this line compared to the version without the moves knight c3 and bishop b4, g4 thrown in, is that once we develop the queen's bishop, we can meet queen d8 with rook d8 and just have that very healthy development. This is the reason why castling is maybe a little bit better from white's point of view. But even then, you have a lot of good choices. Like, if you really want to avoid an endgame, you can play bishop d6 here, but personally, I think that in a position like this, black is just doing fine. You've got the pin on the knight to be a little bit annoying. You might be wondering, well, Max, can't black just play bishop f3 and just win a pawn with this knight d4 fork? Obviously, it shows you have a good tactical vision if you consider this possibility in advance. But it is a little bit messy, because after f4, white does get quite a strong attack in the center, and black is still fine, but you do have to be quite precise. And I think that for the average player, it's going to be much easier to play well after bishop c5 than in the lines where bishop f3 are a lot more complicated. But the choice is yours at the end of the day. Now, if white does play bishop b5, I just recommend playing the move bishop knight to d7. Again, breaking the absolute pin to the king from the knight to the king, so that we can meet d5 with knight d4, and once again, I'd get that kind of decent, kings in the entire position. And one idea that's also good to know, I kind of mentioned it before in passing, we didn't really see it so explicitly, because after h3, some of you might be thinking, well, let's just keep the bishop pair. But actually, it's a very cool idea to actually give up the bishop pair so that we can go bishop g5 and trade off our bad bishop, which was kind of stuck behind our pawn structure, whereas we can see that white's bishop is very well complemented by the pawns on the dark squares. And so it's just nice to be able to trade up our bad bishop for their good bishop. It's a good thing to look out for as you start to get more comfortable with tactics and piece safety and all that good stuff. Now, white could play a move like d5, which is maybe a little bit more critical, but it turns out that the double pawns are actually not that big of a problem. The weak pawn weaknesses tend to be more of an issue when they're on a half-open file, just as a general sort of pattern. Here we do also have the bishop pair to kind of make up for those double pawns, so at the end of the day, whether you play the more abstract a5 move or to play a move like f6 to not have to worry about your bishop getting harassed, either way, black is going to be quite okay here. You get a fighting position with good scope to play for the win, with really some quite natural developing moves to follow. So finally, that leaves us with the move of d takes e5, which, yeah, in a way is kind of the big question. Can't white just play this and try to win a pawn with queen d8, saying bishop d8, king d8 runs into bishop f7, and that if knight d8, white can play knight takes e5. Well, first of all, we are attacking the pawn on e4, so actually we aren't, losing a pawn by force. I do want to mention if they do defend the pawn, say if they play knight c3 or, castles instead, we can just play the move of bishop to d6 here. Like, if white plays quietly, you can often go bishop e6 and even just trade off the pieces in case you want very reliable equality. But if things do get a little bit spicier, let's say if white goes bishop g5, something that's really useful to understand with this kind of typical queenless middle game is that bishop f6 is not actually that big of a threat. Kind of like I was talking about just before with, the double c-pawns being not such a big deal when they're not on a half-open file and when you sort of have the bishop pair to make up for it. It's kind of a similar story with bishop f6 as well, where it's not that easy to actually attack this supposed weakness. We do get quite a bit of counterplay down the g-file as well to make up for it. And there were a couple of games where white played this, just trying to clamp down and sort of, use the f5 square to their advantage. But we also have dynamic ideas as well. We can go b5 and if bishop b3, we can start to kick that bishop around like a soccer ball. Or if bishop b3, we can also play knight to e6 and bring the knight around this way. And what we kind of see if we just play natural moves for both sides is that it's actually not that easy for white to to sort of get his ideas in a sense, because we are threatening the little, Noah's Ark's trap against the bishop, and if they try stop with a3, we can go bishop e6, and that puts one in a bit of a no-win situation, because obviously they don't want to just let us, take on b3 and win a pawn, but if they do take, we can then take back, and they don't have that f5 square for the knight, because our pawn is covering it, meaning that their whole plan was basically just an abject failure at this point. So it kind of shows you how you can actually outplay your opponent strategically, even from these seemingly very quiet, symmetrical-looking pawn structures. This sort of imbalance in the piece placement does, shape the game a little bit. Now, after knight e5, if you do end up playing the move knight e4, like, without thinking it, it's not the end of the world. You can still, make it work and still have a playable position here. But the move that really works great for black is the move of bishop to d6. And you're basically just going to take on e4 next move, and you can just play the move of bishop e6, just attacking their bishop. And then if they take, you can also take back with the knight and just have very active piece placement. I think something that's worth understanding for those of you who are maybe thinking, well, isn't this a little bit too symmetrical? Isn't this a little bit drawish? I would disagree, because in a position like this one up, say bishop e7, white constantly has to be on the lookout for moves like knight d4 to attack the pawn here. Also, our king is closer to the battlefield than their king is. We're going to be faster to the center than them in case the pieces get traded. So it's very much a position in which you can play for a win here as black. You just have to be a little bit patient and kind of let the chances come to you in a sense. But if they play knight f3 instead, then yeah, it's going to be the same sort of idea with knight e4, bishop e6, where again, if they take, you're going to be pretty happy with the arising position. But if they do play rook e1 and try to have a bit more imbalance in the structure, well, we're kind of happy with this. It is true that in the arising position with knight c3 and knight b5, yeah, it is obstacle bishop, so it is true that it is quite a safe position, but it is still an obstacle bishop position with a lot of other pieces on the board. So there is still scope to, to try to outplay the opponent from here. It's nowhere near as drawish as you might think on a first glance when you've got the knights and rooks to back up your bishop. But anyhow, that's my coverage of d4, and I know it was quite a long coverage, so I want to thank those of you who, did take the time to go through it. Like I said, I think these are just very fascinating positions, and that by understanding them, it just allows you just to have a much better feel for chess in general. It's basically by absorbing a lot of these patterns over and over again that allow you to kind of play for that pattern recognition and intuition of a chess master. Obviously, it takes a lot of time, but if you do it for long enough, you are going to get there. But in the game, Niemann played the move of c3 instead. And after c3, if black just plays a move such as knight f6 without really thinking, you are running into knight g5. You do have to be a little bit careful of this, because the only move here is to play d5, but then white gets in the two knights with quite a useful extra move of c3, which we would admittedly prefer to avoid. So you do have to be a little bit careful, also because if you do play bishop e7 trying to avoid knight g5 problems, well, then you get hit by queen b3, and the fact that this pawn is coming under an early attack is obviously far from ideal from black's perspective. So just showing you why these moves don't work, just so you know to avoid them. And what we do instead is a lot more enterprising. This is an idea from the very creative Russian grandmaster Daniel Dubov, who played the move of f5, which is also the move that Caruana played in this game, where we go for this attack on the center and kind of make the point that maybe white would prefer to have the knight rather than the pawn on c3 in such a position. Niemann played the move d3, because you'll notice that now the move queen b3 it's just not as scary when, bishop f7 is a little bit of an empty shot. It might look annoying, but, there are moves like knight a5 and even just taking the pawn that kind of mess up white's up a little bit. To be fair, you're not really going to face queen b3 much, so I'm not going to go and say more than that, even though some of the variations can be a bit beautiful. It's a little bit of a tangent. Now, what a lot of players will do, say around 1600 level and below, is they will think, okay, it's an exchange of a pawn for pawn, so it's an equal exchange. But it's not really true, because after bishop f5, our bishop is a lot more active with the recapture. We've caught up in development. D4 is just very well met by e4 and just taking over the center with our pawns. which is why instead white should castle first. So that if e4, they can at least play rook e1 and kind of defend their knight with the help of this pin. But in this case, we can play d5 and just have that strong foothold in the center. You can kind of feel how we're really fighting for the initiative tooth and nail here. You can play bishop d6 if you want to, but I kind of like the move queen f6 better, where you just prepare castling along as soon as possible to get out of this pin. And the position is one, yeah, if you're a professional player, you might explore this a bit more deeply, but I think for everyone else, we can say that Black's play is quite straightforward. We've got the extra space in the center, so it's good potential to outplay the opponent from this middle game. And this explains why Niemann played the move d3, but maybe he was a little bit surprised by Caruana's next move. He might have been expecting a move like f4. Before I talk about f4, I should point out as well that a move like knight f6 might seem very natural, but again, knight g5, you do have to watch out for this because this can be a big problem in some positions. So f4 to kind of cut off the communication of the bishop and stop knight g5. It's definitely a very natural looking move, and I won't go as far as to call it a mistake, but it's not as good as the move Caruana played, because after d4, queen e7, white just gets a little bit too strong of an attack, and the kind of kingside attack that we'll see in the game just doesn't really work quite as well with queen on e7 compared to on f6 as such. We kind of want to have that square available for the knight or for the bishop in some cases. And that's the reason why Caruana played the move queen to f6. I know it looks a little bit weird to put the queen and not the knight on f6, but it also does have the point that, for example, if they go knight g5, we can go knight h6 and kind of cover it that way, so that this knight g5 or the problems of other lines is not going to be such a pertinent issue here. If white does play a move like f4, by the way, which did happen in this quite well-known, at least among professionals, game between Fedoseev against Dubov, well, our plan is we can just castle queenside with long castles. There are some very beautiful variations with fe5 actually that can arise. Well, to be fair, both the variations are quite amazing, but there's kind of a sort of common trap that comes up in both of them. So let's say if white goes fe5 takes and ef5, the computer suggests a bit of a weird move of knight e7. Again, if you're, let's say, not a professional player, it's going to be more useful to just kind of just sort of like just take in the ideas rather than trying to memorize it. But basically the point is that we sacrifice the rook. But then after bishop c5, we get this very strong attack with moves like queen h4 and trying to get some mating ideas like this. Actually, if king h1, you can even just take the knight. That's actually going to be giving you also some very good compensation. But after d4, sort of trying to buy some time with blocking this, well, we can kind of see how after, say, king h1, for instance, that we can go queen h4, threaten the mate with knight g3, because, well, not mate, but a very strong fork as such with the pin. And even though black has only one pawn for the exchange, we can just feel the energy where all of black's pieces are very dynamically placed, and it's going to be quite hard for white to resist this initiative of all of the pieces flooding into the attack. So if white does play ef5, which is what happened in the Fedoseev-Dubov game, this is where things get really fun, because it might look like you can't play knight f5 because of knight f7, but there are actually some very beautiful ideas you can play with d5 after that. For example, after takes and bishop c5 here, you just get this flooding attack. And in the game, or in the main line we have the move of bishop to of knight a3 kind of flicked in first just to try to gain a tempo. But it's still going to be the same idea of opening up bishop c5 and just going for the big attack. And this is also a position where if you do want to pause and try to figure out the trick that black has here, it does make a really nice, a very nice calculation puzzle, especially for the more advanced viewers. But yeah, very well done if you realize, even if you need to pause the video, which I might expect you to do to find it. But it turns out rook hf8 is really beautiful. And the point is that they actually can't take the rook here, because then we can play this very cool move knight g3, and it's actually going to be a forced checkmate here with the mate down the h-file. So that's a good little mating pattern to know as well. And obviously, the more you see these mating patterns, the more automatic they'll become in your for seeing them in your games. But that's just to give some example of some of the really amazing lines that can ensue from here. Now in the game, white played a move of castles, and we'll kind of see from the game continuation why this seemingly safe move, bring the king to safety, is actually putting the king in very serious peril. But I also want to touch on a few other moves. There are a lot of moves I didn't analyze, to be fair, so again, this will be a little bit of a long section of the video. But there are moves like e takes f5, queen to b3, knight a3. Obviously, I already just looked at knight g5, but they also have moves such as bishop g5 and knight bd2. And again, the reason I'm going to kind of show you these moves rather than just being lazy and saying, okay, castles was the move played, look at how Caruana just crushed his opponent. It's not just, the intellectual honesty, showing you also white's best moves and, seeing that white can get a small advantage if they play perfectly. When you play these shortcuts, there is usually some risk attached to it, of course. But, saying no risk, no reward. But it's also going to just give you a much better understanding of the arising positions from there. So, in any case, after queen f6, if they play ef5, it's kind of noteworthy that you're actually not going to take back with a piece as you might expect. Concretely, you have to watch out for this queen b3. That's one of the main tactical plays you need to keep an eye out for when you play this variation. But the move knight e7 is a really wonderful idea, where we're just preparing to kick away that bishop while also developing a piece. We do technically have a lead in development at this moment. And if they try to hang on to the pawn with g4, which did actually happen in a game between two, I think, Arab IMs from memory, well, then you can play d5. And even if they gain a tempo with this intermezzo, it's actually not that big of a problem, because we can play the move of a6 here. And if they exchange, you actually get pretty good compensation. We're just going to be able to kick away their pawn with h5, or even a move like g6 to sort of get at their structure that way. It's kind of like a king's gambit where you also have the bishop pair advantage, which is what sort of makes it playable for black. But if white does play a move like bishop a4, which might seem quite innocuous, well then the move of h5 is quite good. And the reason, by the way, we don't play h5 immediately is that knight h4 ends up giving a bit of an annoying pressure, sort of exploiting the weaknesses around the black king side. But here knight h4 is not really going to work, because we have the option to break the pin, and meaning that we are able to kind of cover that g6 square with the knight now. And after bishop c2 takes, it just turns out that black is just much better, where we use that pin on the pawn to regain the pawn and still have our wonderful center and our lead in development, and also note how unsafe the white king is here in the long term with the position opening up. So ef5, not really something to fear, but is a little bit trappy, so that's why I want to make sure I mentioned it. If they try queen b3 first, we can probably see that it's not going to be as effective when the pawn is already defended here. But still, we should, at least know the following move if we want to play this at a professional level. For the rest of you, I think you probably don't need to commit this to memory because it's a bit of a rare line, but the move a6 is actually a very nice move here, with the idea that in a lot of positions you can go b5 and kind of kick away the bishop and sort of resolve kind of the tension that's in the position that way. There are also some positions where knight a5 starts to become an idea as well, when they don't have the move of queen b5 in response. Like, for example, I know it looks very weird, but bishop e7 is actually the top line of the engine here at a high depth. Kind of just looking to resolve the position and try to play against the black king that is, a bit stuck in the center. But we can play the move of knight a5 to resolve that problem, just trying to get rid of their bishop so we can castle short. And after queen a4, knight c6, there are different things they can play to try to attack. But it's definitely quite a dynamic position with ideas like g5 to just go for the attack, where we kind of delay castling long, so that way we're not casting into the pawn storm and the ready-made attack that white's going for. And yeah, I'll admit that white's probably a little bit better in this position with best play. Again, that's the risk you take when you play one of these sidelines. But it's definitely an interesting position with clear imbalances. Black has a lot of long-term advantages and chance for an initiative. So certainly all three results are possible from this point. A move like knight a3 is not so common, but again, you can kind of just play f4. And just the one thing you do have to be a little bit careful of is if they do play knight b5, just sort of don't fall asleep and play the move of long castles, because then you will run into problems with losing a pawn and having your king just being very weak in the arising position. So you do have to play this bit ugly king d8 move. The lines are a little bit risky, but you are able to, consolidate your f4 pawn and keep the position stable enough that you're basically going to be okay here. Now, if they play a move such as bishop g5, kind of like we saw before, but without the move queen b3 flicked in, again, you do want to make sure that you don't fall for bishop f5, queen b3. I'm mentioning this trick a few times so that you don't fall for it in your own games. But after queen f5, we still have a pretty decent position. Like, one of the main ideas for black will be to play bishop e7 and kind of take back with the knight in order to get your pieces quite active. I analyze this in quite a lot of depth, actually, but that's sort of the main idea to know in this position. That, if queen b3 can still play bishop e7 anyway, that it looks very risky because you are letting the queen into your position, but it turns out the queen by itself's not that great of an attacker, and the fact their piece is so stuck does mean that you're basically going to be okay here in this position. So you can take my word for it, that I looked at it with the engine, and black is indeed fine. Now, if they play the move knight bd2, that's actually the best move in the position, in my opinion, but it's also a move that you're probably not going to face unless you are facing a well-prepared opponent with a computer. So we're looking at, let's say, 2-400 plus FIDE opposition here. Now, at this point, I think that a move like f4, it's obviously not as effective as in the game when white hasn't castled into the attack, but it's sort of instructive to see that a move like h4 is quite nice, where you just sort of do a bit of a prophylaxis, and obviously it makes more sense when your king is still having the option to castle long later. And I do think a position like this one is kind of a demonstration of what white is aiming for in these positions, that they're able just to take the center and just kind of grab this space on the center and on the queen side, and make the point that black's position is not completely harmonious without a ready-made pawn break in the position. Because obviously g5 takes kind of helps open up the file for the rook, and doesn't really serve our interests, let's say. So that's the reason why I think knight e7 is definitely the preferable choice. And again, this position is not like 100% equal. White does have a small edge with best play, but you do get a very interesting position. Like, for example, now h4 is not going to be as effective when we haven't played f4. We still have that flexibility to go h6 and kind of move towards a more normal kind of King's Indian type of position, where we do have some active piece play and pawn play to go with it. If they play b4, you just go g5. Like, you don't even need to play the move f4 right away. You can keep that tension and kind of go for the throat, and use the fact they don't really have a great square for their knights as well, in a sense. That shows a little bit of disadvantage of knight to d2. And it maybe also explains why white plays the move of d4. It's probably the optimal move here. Well, along with h4, I'd say these are probably the two best moves. And even though the computer will tell you that you can technically take the pawns without losing, you're also just giving white a very strong attack and kind of opening lines for him to go after the king. So I do think it's a lot more practical to go f4 and just keep the position a bit more closed while you're catching up in development. If you can get in g5 and g4, even with the king on e1, that just gives you a very nice attack. We can obviously see that white's pawn play in his closed position is a lot slower. And that's something really important to understand when it comes to these closed pawn structures, that it does come down to finding those pawn breaks to open the position in your favor, and that's just going to be a lot easier for black than for white here. That being said, white does have the move h4 to stop g5. That's kind of the one move that can throw a bit of a, let's say, a spanner in the works. But if you know this idea of knight g5 and you can kind of maneuver the piece around this way, you are still going to have a reasonable enough position where, I think in a case like this, I'm kind of playing just the natural moves both sides just to get a position on the board. But I do think this middle game is quite reasonable. It's not that easy for white to open the queen side in their favor, and we do have some squares for our pieces to, get some play going. The fact that white can't so easily castle means that it'll be difficult for them to fully harmonize their pieces. So it's a position where I would be reasonably happy with black's chances, and certainly as a worst case scenario, this is not such a bad one to my mind. But with that, we can now go into the actual game. And as obviously as I mentioned before, I put in some timestamps. It's a bit of a longer video, so put the timestamps so that if you want to just see the game or just focus on certain variations, it just does that for you. But I think from even just looking at some of the other variations, we can kind of understand now why castling is a little bit of a mistake. If you need a sort of reminder, like just to kind of put in your long-term memory, you might like to, just wait until that move comes to your mind and the plan comes to your mind before we we go further. But yeah, the plan of this system is to go for the pawn storm on the king side, just like in the king's Indian defense. And as I said before, Naroditsky would be very proud of the way that Caruana played in this game. I didn't mention it before, but it's kind of a funny point yet to sort of see that, it's a, player of Italian descent who, is showing us how to beat the Italian game. Kind of a funny coincidence there. But yeah, if knight a3, you can play the move bishop e7. I just wanted to show this cool idea of bishop d8, just so you have a way to, deal with this annoying knight maneuver in a sense, where here it's just not really going to be a problem, but it's just a little move order point. If white does follow the principle of meeting a flank attack with a counter in the center, kind of the drawback of this is that even if you take, you're not really sort of opening up the lines in such a way you can use so effectively, because it takes a long time to really even set up any sort of attack on the d file. And if they play d5, yeah, obviously we're quite happy with a more close kind of position. That would just be an absolute dream for black to be able to play the kingside attack without even having to worry about the center. But if bishop knight a3, yeah, again, you can play bishop e7 and, be able to meet knight b5 with bishop d8. And yeah, there are a few details, but basically the point is that this is just going to be a fine position for black. We're ready to storm forward and just have a really big attack on their king, which practically is, of course, rather nettlesome for white. Now after f4, white played b4 instead, trying to get some play going. Yeah, the engine doesn't love it, but it's kind of understandable from a human point of view. No, I think that knight e7 is even not really strictly necessary. I think you could just go for the throat with g5 and, just throw the pawns at their king in a sense. At some point, yeah, you might want to go knight e7 and sort of develop some pieces first. But yeah, your plan is going to be either go f3 and just rip open their king, or, you can also just play moves like h4, h3, g3. The point is that when you have so many different ways to play your attack, it just makes it so much more likely that the attack is going to work in a sense. Still, it would be too far to call knight e7 a mistake by any means, but it does give white a chance to try to get back on the right track. And okay, in the game, Niemann wanted to kick away the knight before playing d4. One drawback of this is that if black does play knight a5, they are kind of blockading the queen side in their favor, and it kind of turns out that, yeah, d4 just kind of loses its sting when you don't have the piece pressuring the e5 pawn to kind of back up the pawn in the center. So this would actually be a very, very good position for black. But even in the game, even without Caruana playing it perfectly, we could still see that this position is still very nice for black. And I think it's very encouraging as well when you can kind of see there you don't have to play all the best moves to make this idea work, that even if you sort of mess up a couple of details, you still have like the still general plan to follow to be able to put pressure on the opponent. And after knight a3, yeah, if you decide at this point that you want to get some more pieces out and play bishop e6, trying to set up favorable exchanges so that if they take, our knight gets to a better square of their capture. One of the good old Soviet chess techniques of setting up favorable exchanges. Also something that Hikaru is incredibly good at, by the way. Well done, you actually played it better than Caruana. I'm not sure if he was concerned about some ideas like a5 and some sort of counterplay like this, but you can play bishop h6, and it sort of turns out that knight b5 and try and go for this fork, you can actually meet with castles, and the fact that their bishop is under attack and that you also can take their rook at the end does sort of allow this to work out, where you will have a very strong attack against the white king here. A bit like we'll see in the game later on, actually, with the pawn going to f3, like a fawn pawn. Have almost like a bone in their throat that's sort of choking them in a sense. But the move knight e6 was played in the game, and again, white should probably go for this a5 and try to get in some b6, knight b5 tricks to get counterplay. But in the game, Niemann tried to accelerate the idea with b6, trying to get it in this sort of way. But the problem is after c6, it's just very hard for white to really open things in their favor. Probably at some point over the next several moves, Niemann should have just taken on a7 and at least tried to open up the queen side and get some play. But it is true, this is still a pretty bad position for white. Though maybe not as bad as what happened in the game, at least. Because after bishop a2, yeah, it's understandable white wants to try to bring the knight into c4, but unfortunately it just doesn't really do a whole lot here. Actually, if you can even play a move like a5 if you want to. It's a little bit computerish, but kind of the idea is that the seemingly very promising knight d6 is actually not that effective, because you have this really cool idea of rook h7, where you can kind of sort of trap their queen or at the very least force their queen to a really bad square in some lines, and it just allows you to have this very, very strong attack. Probably even close to a decisive attack, actually. So, well, they can play knight d3, but it's still kind of bad for white in a sense. Caruana played knight g5, which, from a human point of view, is certainly a natural enough move. And the only argument that the engine really has against it is the fact that white can try to go ba7 and try to open up the queen side, which obviously a5 kind of avoids in that sense. It keeps it more locked up. But yeah, at some point, white didn't really make the most of his chances. He played the move of bishop a3 here. And black plays the move bishop c4 just to resolve that pressure against the d6 pawn. To be fair, there's a lot of good moves to black. I even hasten a little bit. I'm hesitant to share it as a puzzle, but what do you think is the move for black to really cap off the kingside attack? White doesn't really have a big threat, so we kind of have open sliver to do what we want on the king side here. And the answer here in this position is that we can play the move f3. That's the move that Caruana played. If you want to develop or take the pawn, I mean, you can play those moves as well, but f3, it's just going to be much more to the point, because if we're able to open up their king like this, you can kind of see how the knight's just an absolute octopus, just, seeing seemingly everything in this position. I know it's easy to bring the queen in, the knight in the attack. The attack just flows from here. So white tries to keep it close with g3, but now you've got this pawn just permanently in white's throat, and all you have to do is really kind of get the pieces on the h-file, and you're going to have a mating attack. So let's see how that manifested in the game. So after rook ae1, now you might have noticed that d5 does technically win a piece with the double attack here, but it actually also is very impractical, because even though you're totally winning from a computer point of view, from a human point of view, your king is under attack, white's taking back the initiative. It's much easier if you just keep the control and just don't give them any counterplay whatsoever. It takes longer, but it's a much more sure way of winning, and that's what matters when it comes to converting a winning position. So the way the game concluded was black just did this little rook lift to bring the rook over to the king side, teeing up for hg3 at the right moment. White played the move of bishop g5, and then after queen b3 takes, obviously something like this is just going to be pretty much a forced mate one way or the other. So white plays queen b6, but yeah, at this point white just resigned, because there's no real way to stop queen h2 checkmate, and we can see that the checks are very quickly going to run out for white from here. So yeah, that was this really nice game between Niemann against Caruana, and of course I understand the video would have been a lot shorter if I had just shown you the game and already talked about the opening. But it was really important to me to really solve what I think is a very common problem for many chess players, which is how to play against the Italian. Because after all, the Italian is the system that you will face the most often, let's say below a 1800 or 2000 level of play, at least online. And we've seen how d6 has that flexibility where sometimes you can play it very solidly, and sometimes you can play it more dynamically with moves like c3, f5, or this bishop g4 pin in some variations as well. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with this. Do let me know in the comments below. Let me know what was one thing that you really liked about this video. Maybe you noticed the better quality of the lighting and so forth and the camera. Maybe you just kind of enjoyed, I guess, something a little bit different about the presentation style. But let me know what that is. It just helps me to make this content that's just going to help you as much as possible to improve your chess, and also in a way to kind of keep Danya's memory alive, at least give myself some sort of shot to maybe have some of the level of influence that he would have had over the next 50 or 60 years, if he had lived to that to like 2090 years as such. But anyway, I had a lot of fun with this one, and I will see you in the next training. Take care, y'all.